Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I'm NJ. It's good to have you here tonight. Wherever you are, whatever hour it happens to be where you're listening, whether it's late evening in Britain, somewhere past midnight in the middle of America, an early grey morning in Australia, or one of those strange in-between hours that don't really belong to any part of the day at all, you're very welcome. Settle in. There's nothing you need to do for the next few hours except lie still and let a story arrive. If you're new here, Sleep into Power is a place where history, psychology, philosophy, consciousness, human behavior, and the quiet forces that shape society are turned into long, calm, cinematic documentaries. The idea is simple. You get something genuinely worth knowing, delivered at a pace slow enough to fall asleep to. You don't have to follow every thread. You don't have to remember any of it. If you drift off 8 minutes in and wake up somewhere in the middle of a story about a family who have been maintaining the same roof for 400 years, that's exactly how this is meant to work. Before we begin, a few things, and I'll keep them brief. The Sleep into Power book is available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. It explores how imagination, habit, the subconscious mind, and the particular quality of the moments just before sleep can shape the way we think, feel, and move through our lives, with practical ideas for using those moments a little more deliberately rather than letting them use us. If the ideas in these documentaries interest you, the book is where a lot of the underlying thinking lives. Every episode is also available on Spotify for anyone who prefers listening with the screen off and the phone face down. There's also the companion channel, Meditate into Power, where you'll find guided meditations, calming ambience, relaxation, and shorter experiences designed for switching off, resetting, and unwinding. And if you'd like to support the continued making of these documentaries, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link. It genuinely helps, and it's genuinely appreciated. All of those links are down below in the description. If you're enjoying what we do here, do subscribe. It costs nothing, and it makes a real difference to a channel like this one. And to everyone who has already subscribed, who comes back week after week, who leaves the comments that shape what gets made next. Thank you. You know who you are. Right, let's begin. Imagine a house. Not a palace, not a film set, not the kind of place that appears in glossy photographs with a helicopter shot and a swimming pool. Something quieter than that. An old family house somewhere in the European countryside. It could be in Britain, in a fold of land where the road narrows and the hedges close over. It could be in France, in Italy, in Germany, or Spain. The particular country matters less than the age. The house is not perfect. Parts of it are cold. Something on the north side has been leaking since before the current owners were born. And there is a file somewhere containing 40 years of correspondence about it. But it has survived. It has survived wars that redrew the borders of the continent. It has survived economic collapse, changes of government, revolutions in taste, the invention of the motor car, the invention of the internet, 3 or 4 separate tax regimes, designed more or less explicitly to break up estates, exactly like this one. It has survived family arguments so bitter that certain rooms carry the memory of them. It has survived the deaths of everyone who built it, and everyone who first furnished it, and everyone who first ate at its table. Portraits hang in the hall. Some are good, several are not. They have not been arranged by a curator to impress a visitor. They are there because that is where they have always been, and moving them would feel obscurely wrong. Books fill rooms that have been used by 6 or 7 generations of the same family, and the books are not decoration. Some of them have notes in the margins in a hand nobody alive can identify. There is a dining table, and people have sat at that table who died before anybody currently living was born. Now imagine a child growing up inside that house. Nobody sits the child down. There is no lesson, there is no evening on which an adult closes the door, lowers their voice and says, "Right, here are the rules of our kind of family, memorize them." Instead, the lessons arrive almost invisibly, the way a language arrives, through repetition, through atmosphere, through the thousand small corrections and non-corrections of ordinary life. The child learns how adults in this house speak, and how they don't, what gets discussed at dinner, and with what degree of seriousness, how the people who work in the house are addressed, and what happens if you address them badly, what you wear when a certain kind of visitor is coming, and what you wear when you're going out into the fields, which schools the family attends, as though the attending were a fact of nature rather than a decision, who arrives at the door and is shown straight in, and who is kept waiting in a particular room. The child learns what is considered embarrassing, which is not the same as what is considered wrong. The child learns what is considered vulgar, which is not the same as either. The child learns what is never discussed outside the family, and learns it so early that the rule stops feeling like a rule and starts feeling like taste. The child learns how money is spoken about in this house, or how it is deliberately not spoken about, and either way absorbs a whole grammar around it. The child learns how the family remembers itself, which ancestor is spoken of with warmth, which one is spoken of with a small pause first. The child learns, without anybody using the word, that privilege here is supposed to come attached to some kind of obligation, even if the obligation is honored hypocritically, as often as it is honored sincerely. The child learns how introductions are made, how a reputation is protected, how a roof is maintained, and, most strangely of all, the child learns to hear adults making decisions on behalf of grandchildren who do not yet exist and may never exist. The child is not simply inheriting money, the child is inheriting a system of behavior. And here is the question this whole documentary is going to circle for the next few hours. Is that, in the end, the real advantage? Not the money itself, but being raised inside a culture that was quietly designed to preserve it. Because the strange thing about great fortunes is how fragile most of them turn out to be. Vast sums of money appear in one generation and are gone by the third. Names that dominated an entire industry vanish so completely that their descendants have to explain the connection at parties. And yet, alongside all that disappearance, certain family names persist for 200 years, 400 years, occasionally longer, still attached to land, to institutions, to buildings, to boards, to influence. So what are those families actually doing differently? That's the question. And I want to say something clearly before we go any further, because it shapes everything that follows. There is no secret handbook. There is no counsel. There is no rule book passed hand to hand at private clubs. Anybody who tells you they have decoded the 12 laws of the aristocracy is selling something. The families we are going to talk about tonight disagree with each other, dislike each other, marry, and then sue each other, and behave in completely different ways, depending on the century, the country, the religion, and the individual personalities involved. A Quaker chocolate dynasty in York, and a Neapolitan princely house, and a Japanese temple-building family, and a Boston banking family, are not variations on one culture. They are entirely separate worlds that happen to share one problem, which is how to carry something valuable across time. What is genuinely hidden is not a conspiracy. It's something much more ordinary and much more difficult to copy. It's informal transmission, habits absorbed rather than taught, expectations breathed in, environments that do the teaching so early that the learning is invisible, even to the person who did it. Nobody formally teaches this, because the people who know it mostly learned it by growing up inside it. That is the hidden part. And it turns out to be far more interesting than any secret handbook could ever be. Let's start with the term itself, because it's slipperier than it sounds. Old money is not an economic category. No tax authority recognizes it. No survey measures it. It's a cultural term, and like most cultural terms, it means slightly different things depending on where you're standing. In Britain, It has historically been tangled up with land and title. The great families of the 18th and 19th centuries derived income from agricultural estates, and their social position was formally encoded in a peerage. Being old money in that context often meant belonging to a family that had held land for centuries and had a name that appeared in a book of reference. In continental Europe, it fragments further. In France, the distinction between the noblesse d'épée, the old sword nobility, and the noblesse de robe, the families ennobled through judicial and administrative office, was a live social boundary for centuries. In Italy, the picture is different again, because Italian elite families were frequently urban and mercantile rather than rural. Florence and Venice and Genoa produced dynasties whose money came from banking, wool, silk, shipping and trade, and who then acquired land and titles afterwards. The Medici were bankers before they were dukes. In the United States, the term arrives without any aristocracy underneath it, and so becomes almost purely about time. The Boston Brahmins, the old Dutch families of New York, the Philadelphia and Charleston elites. In American usage, old money often simply means money that arrived before the last big wave of money, which makes it a permanently moving line. In the 1880s, the established New York families regarded the railway and steel fortunes as brash newcomers. 50 years later, those same railway families were the old guard, looking down on somebody else. And this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something. Old money is frequently just new money that survived long enough to acquire a patina and a good story about itself. Every great fortune has a first generation. Somebody made it. And in a striking number of cases, they made it in ways that would not survive close examination today. Established European and American wealth has come from land seized in conquest, from monopolies granted by favor, from banking arrangements that were essentially state capture, from mining and railways built on brutal labor conditions, from plantation agriculture, from colonial extraction, and directly from the transatlantic slave trade. Britain's compensation payments to slave owners in 1833, following abolition, transferred an enormous sum to those owners rather than to the enslaved, and the research project at University College London that traced those payments has documented in detail how that capital flowed into country houses, businesses, art collections, and institutions that are still with us. That is not a footnote to the history of established wealth. In a number of cases, it is the foundation. So we are not here to admire anyone. We're here to look at a system and understand how it works, including the parts of it that are indefensible. Which brings us to the distinction that actually matters. There is a difference between a family that has been rich for a long time and a family that has built the machinery to stay rich. The first is a description, the second is an achievement, and not necessarily an admirable one, but an achievement all the same. Because here's the thing that surprises people. Preserving a fortune is usually harder than creating one. Creating wealth typically requires one person or a small group to be extraordinarily good at one thing for a period of years. It rewards focus, risk appetite, obsession, and a certain willingness to ignore other people's opinions. Preserving wealth requires something almost opposite. It requires coordination across people who did not choose each other, who have different temperaments and different needs, some of whom are not yet born. It requires structures that outlast personalities. It requires the founder's own children to cooperate, and their children's children to cooperate, and it requires all of that to hold together through divorces, deaths, market crashes, wars, tax changes, and at least one generation who find the whole thing suffocating and want out. The person who is brilliant at building a fortune is very often exactly the wrong person to design its 100-year governance. Those are different skills. They may even be opposing ones. Keep that in mind as we go, because almost everything that follows is a response to that single problem. Let your shoulders drop for a moment. There's a long way to go and nothing at all to keep up with. If there is one habit underneath all the others, one root from which most of the rest grows, it is probably this: a tendency to think past the length of a single human life. Most financial thinking, most of the time, is bounded by a lifetime. That's not a criticism. It's the natural horizon of a creature that knows it will die. The question a person normally asks about money is some version of "what can I do with this?" And the implied time frame is now, or this year, or before I get too old to enjoy it. There is a different question, and certain families have asked it habitually for a very long time. What should still exist when my grandchildren inherit this? That single reframing changes almost every decision downstream. It changes whether you sell an asset or reduce your own spending instead. It changes how much debt you're willing to carry, and against what. It changes whether you maintain a building that costs money and produces none. It changes what you invest in, because a thing you're planning to hold for 80 years is not the same as a thing you're planning to hold for 8. It changes how you educate children, because you're not preparing them for a job, you're preparing them for a role. And it changes what you're prepared to do to protect a reputation, because a reputation, in this way of thinking, is not yours. You're borrowing it. The word that families in this position tend to reach for is stewardship, and it's worth pausing on it, because it describes a genuine psychological shift, rather than just a piece of pleasant vocabulary. There is a real difference between the sentence, "I own this," and the sentence, "I am responsible for this, while it is in my care." Ownership is about rights. Stewardship is about duties. Ownership points inward and stops at the boundary of the self. Stewardship points forward, to people you will never meet, who did not ask to be born into this, and who will judge you without your being there to explain yourself. You can see this made almost startlingly literal in one of the most famous documents in the history of European art. The Medici, over roughly 3 centuries, went from wool merchants to bankers, to the papacy, to dukes, and then Grand Dukes of Tuscany. They produced popes and queens of France. They funded Brunelleschi's dome and employed Donatello and Michelangelo. And then, like every dynasty, they ran out. The last of the direct Medici line was Anna Maria Luisa, Electress Palatine, who returned to Florence a widow and outlived her brother, the last Grand Duke. The Grand Duchy was going to pass to the House of Lorraine. Nothing she could do about that. But the family's accumulated art, the collections built up over generations, the paintings and sculptures and antiquities, those were, in a sense, still hers to dispose of. In 1737, she signed an agreement with the incoming rulers, the arrangement usually known as the Patto di Famiglia, the family pact. She handed over the entire Medici collection, and she attached a condition: the works were to remain in Florence. They were not to be removed from the state. They were to be for the benefit of the public and for the attraction of visitors. Think about what that actually is. It is a woman at the very end of a family line, with no children, no heirs, no future generation of her own blood to protect, deciding that the thing she has custody of does not belong to her badly enough to let it be scattered. The Uffizi is, in a meaningful sense, the product of that clause. Millions of people queue for it every year without knowing that they are standing inside somebody's decision about the future. That's stewardship in its purest and most attractive form. It's also, and this is the honest part, not typical. For every Anna Maria Luisa, there is a duke who sold the Rembrandts to cover gambling debts, or a nephew who broke up an estate his grandfather spent 40 years assembling, or an entire branch of a family who took the cash and vanished. Long-term thinking is not automatic among wealthy families. It is not a magical property that attaches itself to old surnames. It's a discipline, and it fails constantly. But where it exists, it tends to have help. It tends to be supported by structures that make short-term thinking difficult, which is a very different thing from expecting people to be virtuous. Consider land, which for most of European history was the ultimate long-form asset. In England, from the 17th century onwards, great estates were commonly held under an arrangement historians call the strict settlement. The details are dense, but the effect is simple and rather brilliant in a cold sort of way. The person in possession of the estate was, in law, closer to a life tenant than an outright owner. He drew the income, he lived in the house. What he could not easily do was sell the land or break it up, because the settlement bound the estate to pass intact to the next generation, and the arrangement was renegotiated and renewed each time an heir came of age. In other words, the system was deliberately designed so that any single generation's stupidity could not destroy the whole thing. It removed the option to cash out. Combine that with primogeniture, the practice of passing the estate whole to the eldest son rather than dividing it among all the children, and you get an extremely powerful engine of continuity. Brutally unfair to younger sons, who were pushed into the church, the army, the law, and the colonies. Brutally unfair to daughters, whose claims were usually settled in cash, but devastatingly effective at keeping land in one piece across centuries. Now look at France after the Revolution. The Napoleonic Code, promulgated in 1804, did something almost opposite. It established forced heirship. A parent could not simply leave everything to one child. A defined portion of the estate, the réserve héréditaire, had to be divided among the children. Napoleon reportedly understood exactly what he was doing. Dividing estates by law was a way of dissolving the territorial power of the old nobility. And it worked. French landholding fragmented in a way English landholding did not. Two neighboring countries, similar climates, similar crops, similar aristocratic cultures, and a completely different pattern of survival, driven substantially by inheritance law. This is one of the most important things to understand about multi-generational wealth, and it will come back repeatedly tonight. The habits matter, but the habits sit inside structures, and the structures often matter more. A family that thinks in generations while the law forces division will struggle. A family that is careless while the law forbids selling may survive anyway. You can see the structural effect at its most extreme in central London. In 1677, a 12-year-old heiress called Mary Davies was married to Sir Thomas Grosvenor, a Cheshire baronet. Her inheritance included a stretch of unpromising marshy land to the west of London, which nobody at the time regarded as the making of anybody's fortune. That land became Mayfair and Belgravia. What the Grosvenor family then did over the following 3 centuries is a case study in the difference between selling and stewarding. Rather than selling freeholds, the estate developed the land and granted long leases. When leases expired, the property reverted. The estate could plan streets, squares, and building standards as a coherent whole, because it never gave up ultimate ownership. Generations of Grosvenors made decisions about street layouts, whose consequences are visible from space. The family, now the Dukes of Westminster, still hold a substantial part of that ground. When the 6th Duke died in 2016, the title and the responsibility passed to his son, then in his 20s, and the commentary at the time focused on the trust structures through which the estate is held. Structures which mean that no individual duke simply owns Mayfair in the way you own your car. Whatever you think about the justice of any of this, and there is a great deal to think about, the mechanism is clear. Do not sell the thing that generates. Sell the fruit, never the tree. Hold the asset in a form that makes it awkward for any one descendant to liquidate on a whim. Sell the fruit, never the tree. If you remember one line from tonight, that's a reasonable candidate. But notice how much of this depends on time doing the work. The Grosvenor family did not become extraordinarily wealthy because of a brilliant transaction in 1677. They became wealthy because London grew westward over 300 years, and they were still holding. That's the thing about long-term thinking that nobody enjoys hearing. Its power comes almost entirely from duration, and duration cannot be bought, borrowed, hacked, or accelerated. It can only be waited out. Let's turn to something you can actually see, which is how money looks from the outside. There's a cliché that established wealth is quiet and new wealth is loud. Like most clichés, it contains something true and then buries it under something false. The false part first, because it needs clearing away. Old money has displayed itself extravagantly and relentlessly throughout its entire history. The idea that aristocratic families were modest is nonsense produced by people who have not looked at their houses. Blenheim Palace is not modest. Versailles is not modest. The Palladian country houses of 18th century England were built explicitly to impress people arriving down a mile-long drive that had been landscaped so the house would appear at exactly the right moment. Families commissioned portraits by the most expensive painters alive and hung them where visitors could not fail to see them. They held balls that cost the annual income of a village. They kept servants in numbers that had nothing to do with need and everything to do with signal. They imported orange trees to a climate that hated them purely to demonstrate that they could. So let's not pretend there was ever a golden age of restraint. What is true, and more interesting, is that the language of display changes depending on how secure the position is. Thorstein Veblen gave us the vocabulary for this in 1899, in The Theory of the Leisure Class. Veblen was a Norwegian-American economist with an unusually acid eye, and he was watching the American Gilded Age at its absolute height. His argument was that a great deal of elite spending is not about utility or even pleasure. It's about demonstrating that you can afford to waste. Conspicuous consumption, he called it, alongside conspicuous leisure, the demonstration that your time is not required for productive work. Veblen also noticed something subtler, which tends to get lost when he's quoted. He pointed out that the signals have to be legible to the audience you care about. A signal that everybody can read is useful when you're addressing everybody. A signal that only a small number of people can read is useful when the small number of people are the ones whose opinion you actually need. That's the real distinction, not loud versus quiet, broad versus narrow. If your position depends on being recognized by strangers, you will signal in a way strangers can decode. Visible brands, obvious price tags, recognizable shapes. If your position depends on being recognized by roughly 400 families who have known each other for generations, then a maker's name known only to those 400 families does the job far more efficiently and has the additional advantage of being invisible to everybody else. This is coded consumption. It is not humility. It is a narrower broadcast. You see it in tailoring, where the signal is a cut and a canvas, and a maker who does not advertise. You see it in furniture, where the signal is provenance rather than price. You see it in wine, where the whole apparatus of appellation and vintage is a shared language among people who have been drinking it since adolescence. You see it in the deliberate shabbiness that certain British families cultivated almost as a sport. The frayed collar, the ancient jacket, the dog on the good sofa. Because when your position is genuinely secure, looking as though you're trying can itself become the embarrassing thing. And this is where restraint becomes something more complicated than a virtue. Restraint can be a status claim. Understatement says, "I do not need to convince you," which is, if you look at it directly, a rather aggressive thing to say. There is a real psychological point buried here, and it holds well beyond the world of estates and country houses. When identity is secure, signaling gets quieter. When identity is uncertain, signaling gets louder. That's true of teenagers, of new arrivals in any social group, of countries with something to prove, and of anybody who has recently acquired something they're not yet sure they're allowed to have. It's not a moral failing, it's what insecurity does. Which means that quiet is not automatically a sign of depth. Sometimes it's just a sign of not needing anything from you. There's a related habit that's less about signaling and more about objects themselves, and I find it one of the more genuinely appealing threads in all of this. A good coat can be repaired, a chair can be reupholstered, shoes can be resoled and resoled again, and then have the welt rebuilt. Silver is polished, linen is mended, a watch goes back to be serviced every few years, and then goes to a son or a daughter. A house is repointed, rewired, re-roofed, and the file of correspondence about the north side leak grows another inch. There is a culture of maintenance rather than replacement, and it ran through established households for centuries. Now, I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this idea circulating at the moment that is basically a sustainability advertisement with a crest on it. The historical motivation was almost never environmental. It was practical, and it was economic in a very specific way. Before industrial mass production, well-made things were extremely expensive relative to income, and labor to repair them was comparatively cheap. That ratio has now inverted almost completely, which is why the modern version of buy it for life is a much harder proposition than it sounds, and often just means buying expensive things. The historical household repaired because repairing was rational, but something else was happening alongside the economics, and that something else is more durable than the economics. Objects that stay accumulate meaning. A chair that has been in the same room for 150 years is not primarily an item of furniture. It's a physical record. Your great-grandmother sat in it. There is a mark on the arm that the family has a story about, and the story may not even be true, but it has been told so many times that the chair now carries it. That transforms the psychology of possession. If your relationship to objects is built on novelty, then every object begins depreciating emotionally the moment you acquire it, because its value was in its newness, and newness is the one quality guaranteed to evaporate. If your relationship to objects is built on continuity, the opposite happens. The object becomes more valuable the longer you have it, because what it holds is accumulating. One system is a treadmill, the other is a bank, and it produces a genuinely different attitude to buying. If you expect to keep something for 40 years, you ask different questions about it. Can it be repaired? Who repairs it? Will the material improve or degrade? Will I still want to look at this when the fashion that produced it has died? Which leads directly into something families in this position tend to teach very early, usually without stating it. Price and value are not the same thing. Expensive does not mean good. It never did. Most of the expensive things available at any given moment are expensive because somebody has worked out how to charge, not because somebody has worked out how to make. Learning to tell the difference requires knowing about craftsmanship, about how a thing is actually constructed. It requires knowing about provenance, where a thing came from and who had it before. It requires knowing about durability, rarity, cultural importance, and the specific and mostly unwritten social meanings that attach to certain objects in certain circles. None of that is taught in schools. All of it is taught in houses. And this is where we should bring in Pierre Bourdieu, because he named the thing more precisely than anybody before or since. Bourdieu was a French sociologist, born in a small village in the Pyrenees to a modest family, who ended up at the very top of the French academic system and spent much of his career dissecting how that system actually worked. His major work on this, Distinction, published in 1979, was based on extensive survey research into French tastes in music, art, food, furniture, and film. What he found was that taste was not randomly distributed. It mapped onto class position with uncomfortable precision, and crucially, it mapped not just onto income, but onto education and family background, which often diverged. His central idea is cultural capital. Alongside economic capital, money and assets and social capital, the networks you can call on, There is a third kind of resource: knowledge, dispositions, competences, and familiarities that function as currency in certain settings. Knowing how to talk about a painting, knowing which composer is being referenced, knowing how to behave in a room where nobody explains the rules, knowing that the rules exist at all. And cultural capital has a beautiful property from the point of view of the people who hold it. It looks like personality. It presents itself as sensitivity or intelligence or having a good eye, when a substantial part of it is simply the residue of exposure. Bourdieu's word for the deep structure underneath it was habitus, the set of dispositions laid down so early, by environment and repetition, that they feel like your nature rather than your history. Being able to afford a painting is one thing. Being able to say something about it that other people in the room find interesting is a different thing entirely, and in certain circles it carries considerably more weight. The first requires money. The second requires having grown up somewhere that paintings were discussed. And knowing which fork to use, incidentally, is the least of it. That's the trivial surface of etiquette, the bit that gets into films. The genuinely useful knowledge is understanding why the codes developed, what they are for, and when breaking them is fine and when it isn't. Anybody can memorize a rule. Knowing when a rule doesn't apply is what fluency actually means. Which brings us to education, and to one of the most persistent misunderstandings about how privilege is actually transmitted. When people talk about elite education, they generally mean schools. Fees, uniforms, old buildings, entrance examinations. Those matter, and I'll come to them. But if you think the advantage is mainly the school, you have located it far too late in the process. By the time a child arrives at a selective school at 11 or 13, an enormous amount has already happened. Consider what the educational environment of an established household looks like before any formal education begins. Books in the house, not as decoration but as furniture that gets used. Adults who read visibly. Conversation that assumes a child will eventually be interested in politics and history and does not simplify itself into oblivion in the meantime. Museums visited casually rather than as an event, so that a child encounters a Titian at 7, and again at 10, and again at 14, and by 20 has a relationship with it. Travel, and specifically travel that involves looking at things rather than lying beside a pool. Languages, sometimes through a household that contains more than one. Music learned to the point of competence rather than abandoned. Sport, often the specific sports that later function as social introductions. Adults who ask a child's opinion at the table and then argue with the answer. The historical version of this ran to remarkable extremes. Among European elites of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Grand Tour was effectively a finishing school, conducted across a continent. A young man, typically accompanied by a tutor who acted as guide and minder, would travel through France to Italy over a period of months or years, studying antiquities, sitting for portraits, buying sculpture, and acquiring the specific cultural fluency that would mark him for life among people who had done the same. The Society of Dilettanti, founded in London in the 1730s by men who had made the journey, is a perfect specimen of the pattern. A shared experience becomes a shared vocabulary, and the shared vocabulary becomes a network with a door on it. Now hold that image next to a modern child growing up in a home where nobody has been to a museum, not from any deficiency of intelligence or curiosity, but because museums were never part of what a weekend was. 20 years later, both are adults. One of them can walk into a gallery and feel at home, can pronounce the names, can tell an anecdote about the painter that lands, appears to possess natural taste. Nothing natural has occurred. What looks like instinct is several thousand hours of exposure that began before conscious memory. This is one of the central mechanisms, and it deserves saying plainly. Privilege very often disguises training as instinct. And that disguise is not usually deliberate. That's the point. The person genuinely does not experience it as training, because they cannot remember a time before it. It feels like who they are. When they meet somebody who lacks the same fluency, the honest interpretation that this person did not have 20 years of immersion is much less psychologically available than the flattering interpretation, which is that this person is not quite as cultured, which is how structural advantage gets quietly relabeled as personal quality, generation after generation. Now the schools. They matter, but they matter in a way that is often misdescribed. The great English schools are old institutions in the literal sense. Winchester was founded in the 1380s, Eton in the 1440s. Their historical function shifted considerably over the centuries, and the version most people picture, with its house system, its games, its prefects, and its formidable emotional culture, is substantially a Victorian invention, designed in part to produce administrators for an empire that needed enormous numbers of confident young men willing to go somewhere unpleasant and run it. Their statistical footprint remains striking. Work published by the Sutton Trust and the Social Mobility Commission in 2019, looking at people occupying senior positions across British public life, found that around 39% of them had attended independent schools, compared with around 7% of the population as a whole. That gap has narrowed in some sectors and barely moved in others. But the pure teaching quality is not where most of the advantage lives, and this is where people get it wrong. Class sizes help, facilities help. What helps more is everything around the teaching. The assumption, held by everyone in the building, that of course you will go to a good university. The alumni structures, the careers advice that consists of a phone call to somebody's father, the internships that arrive through networks rather than applications, and above all the confidence, which is not a personality trait, but a learned expectation that rooms like this one are rooms you belong in. Which brings us to a much smaller and more specific skill, one that almost nobody names, and that turns out to be worth a great deal. Some children are taught, very early and mostly by imitation, how to talk to adults. Not how to be polite to adults, how to converse with them. It's a different thing. Watch what it actually involves. Shaking hands and looking at the person while doing it. Saying your own name clearly. Answering a question with something more than the minimum. Asking a question back, and asking one that the other person might enjoy answering. Remembering names and using them. Being able to stand in a room of strangers for 90 seconds without visible distress. Hosting, which means noticing who has nobody to talk to and doing something about it. Writing a thank you letter, by hand, within a reasonable period, saying something specific. Each of these is trivially small. None of them requires talent, and they accumulate into something that later gets described as charm, or presence, or leadership potential, or that indefinable quality interviewers reach for when they say somebody was very impressive. A child raised in a household where adults came to dinner, where they were expected to greet guests, where they were included in conversation from an age when they understood almost none of it, has rehearsed those behaviours several thousand times before their first job interview. To them, the interview is a slightly formal version of Sunday lunch. To somebody who has never done it, it's an examination in a language they were never taught. And here I want to draw a distinction that matters morally, because there are two very different things that can look the same from outside. There is confidence built on believing you are superior. It is brittle, it is unpleasant, and it collapses badly on contact with reality. And there is confidence built on familiarity, simply having been in rooms like this before, knowing what happens next. Having no particular fear because nothing surprising is likely to occur. The second kind is enormously valuable, and, crucially, it is learnable at any age. It just takes exposure, which is precisely the thing that money and social position hand out for free. Which brings us to the dinner table And I'd like you to picture this one properly, because it's where a great deal of the invisible teaching actually happens. It's evening. There are 3 generations at the table, possibly 4. The food is not remarkable. Somebody has been arguing about the same political question for 40 years and shows no sign of stopping. An uncle is explaining, at unnecessary length, why a particular investment went wrong in 1987. Somebody mentions a name, and there is a fractional pause before the subject changes, and the children register the pause without understanding it. The talk moves through business, land, a court case, a school, somebody's illness, the price of something, a book, a scandal in another family, and back to the political question that has been running for 40 years. The children are half listening. They understand perhaps a fifth of it. They are mostly interested in whether they can leave, and they are learning at an extraordinary rate. Psychologists have a broad term for this: social learning, the acquisition of behavior and knowledge through observation rather than instruction, and the work associated with Albert Bandura from the 1960s onward established just how powerful observation alone can be. But the everyday version is more specific and more mundane than any laboratory finding. It's vocabulary. It's the sense that certain topics are normal and discussable. It's a working model of how the adult world is organized, absorbed years before anybody sits you down and explains it. A child who hears the words trust, executor, freehold, dividend, probate, board, endowment, tenancy, and capital gains used casually at dinner from the age of 6, arrives at adulthood assuming that everybody knows what these words mean. They have no memory of learning them. They will genuinely believe this is common knowledge, and they will be baffled by adults who find these things intimidating. Meanwhile, a child who has never heard those words at home will encounter them for the first time in a solicitor's office, at a moment of stress, from a person charging by the hour, and will feel stupid, and will therefore be less likely to ask. Nothing in that gap is about intelligence. All of it is about vocabulary and its distribution, which leads to a related cliché worth demolishing. It is often said that established families never talk about money. This is not true, and it has never been true. They talk about money constantly. They have to. An estate is a business. A trust is a set of decisions. A family company requires meetings, accounts, arguments, and a great deal of unglamorous administration. What is true is that a distinction is drawn between 2 completely different activities, and the 2 get confused because they share a subject. Discussing money strategically is normal, necessary, and frequent. What are the maintenance costs? What does the lease say? What is the tax position? Do we sell the outlying farms or reduce the household? How is the trust structured, and who are the trustees? What happens when the current generation dies? Announcing money socially is the thing that is regarded as unforgivable. What something cost, what something is worth, what you paid, what you earn, what you're about to buy. The first is management. The second is a claim, and specifically a claim that invites comparison. And comparison is exactly what a family concerned with long-term social position does not want, because comparison invites attention, and attention historically brought tax inspectors, journalists, litigation, kidnappers, and requests. A child raised inside the first culture grows up experiencing money as a system to be administered. A child raised inside the second experiences it as a scoreboard. Those 2 children will make very different decisions for the rest of their lives. If you're getting comfortable, let yourself sink a little further. The next part is about silence, which is a fitting thing to hear at this hour. Discretion is probably the single most consistently observed habit across established families, in wildly different countries and centuries, and it is also the one most easily misunderstood. Discretion is not the same as secrecy. Secrecy conceals something specific. Discretion is a general practice of not broadcasting, applied to everything, including things that are entirely harmless. The habits are recognizable. not discussing personal wealth, not describing family disagreements outside the family, not narrating relationships to people who are not involved in them, not repeating sensitive business information, even when repeating it would make you look well-informed, which is precisely why most people do repeat it, not humiliating anybody in public, including people you dislike, not gossiping indiscriminately, which is different from not gossiping at all, and an understanding, deeply held and rarely articulated, that silence has value, and that spending it carelessly is a form of waste. To see why this developed, you have to remember what reputation used to do mechanically, before credit scores and formal contracts and regulatory oversight. For most of the history of commerce, reputation was the infrastructure. It determined whether a merchant could obtain credit, because there was no other way to assess him. It determined marriage prospects, which determined the transfer of property. It determined political access, club membership, professional partnership, and whether your name on a letter of introduction meant anything. In a world of limited information, a person standing among people who knew them was the primary available data, which meant a careless sentence had genuine mechanical consequences. Not embarrassment, consequences. A rumor about a family's solvency could withdraw its credit. A rumor about a daughter could end a negotiation. A rumor about a son's habits could close a career. Under those conditions, discretion is not a personality preference. It's risk management, and that leads to a broader idea worth developing properly, because it is one of the most useful frames in this whole subject. Reputation behaves like capital. It accumulates slowly, over years of ordinary interactions that individually mean nothing. It can be invested by lending it to somebody through an introduction or a recommendation. It generates returns in the form of opportunities that arrive without being sought. It can be spent, and it can be destroyed extremely quickly, far faster than it was built, sometimes by a single event. Money lost can be made again. There are numerous examples of families who lost fortunes and rebuilt them. Reputation is stickier and more asymmetric. Building takes decades. Demolition can take an afternoon. The starkest illustration I know involves a bank. Barings was founded in London in 1762. Over 230 years it financed governments, was involved in the Louisiana Purchase, survived a near collapse in 1890 that required a rescue organized by the Bank of England, and became so embedded in the British establishment that a French minister in the 1820s is supposed to have listed it among the great powers of Europe. In 1995, it was destroyed in a matter of weeks by unauthorized derivatives trading, conducted from a Singapore office by a single employee, Nick Leeson, whose losses exceeded the bank's entire capital. The institution was sold for a nominal sum. 233 years of accumulated trust, gone inside a quarter. That asymmetry is the thing families concerned with succession understand in their bones. It's why they behave in ways that can look absurdly cautious from outside. They are not protecting their feelings. They are protecting an asset, with a very long build time and a very short demolition time. Reputation also runs forward in a way that is genuinely strange when you think about it. If a surname becomes attached to trustworthiness, competence, discretion, or public service, descendants who did nothing to earn it inherit the benefit of the doubt. And the reverse also holds. Families associated with a scandal can carry it for a century, with grandchildren correcting the record about something that happened before they were born. Now, the honest counterweight, and it's a heavy one. Reputation management has been used, extensively and effectively, to conceal wrongdoing. The same skills, discretion, control of information, the ability to keep matters private, the influence to discourage publication, have protected abusers, buried crimes, silenced employees, suppressed scandals, and shielded the powerful from consequences that anybody else would have faced. This is not a marginal caveat. It is a substantial part of the historical record across elite institutions of every kind, and every serious account of privacy among the powerful has to hold it in view. So we need a distinction, and it's the one that separates a defensible habit from an indefensible one. Legitimate privacy protects people from unwarranted exposure. Illegitimate secrecy protects the powerful from accountability. The two use identical techniques. They are not remotely the same thing, and families that have practiced discretion for generations have, historically, been extremely good at using the first as cover for the second. Which takes us to the darker end of this whole territory, and I don't want to skip it, because a documentary about the habits of established families that only discusses their advantages would be a kind of advertisement. There is a phrase that appears, in one form or another, across many such families, and it can be quietly devastating. Do not embarrass the family. Consider what that instruction does when it is enforced strictly. Historically, it has meant unhappy marriages continued for decades because divorce was a scandal. It has meant sons and daughters whose sexuality was hidden, suppressed, or forced into concealment because acknowledgement was unthinkable. It has meant addiction treated as a matter for discretion rather than treatment. It has meant mental illness kept behind a door, and in the worst cases, behind an institution's door for a lifetime. It has meant children born outside marriage removed from the record. It has meant financial failure hidden until it was catastrophic. It has meant victims of abuse within families being managed rather than protected, because the alternative was exposure. The exact same cultural machinery that produces self-control, long-term thinking, and the protection of a family's standing can, turned slightly, produce silence around genuine suffering. The question is where the line falls, and it's a real question rather than a rhetorical one. At what point does discretion become repression? Perhaps the most workable answer is this. Discretion protects a family from the world. Repression protects a family from itself. The moment silence stops shielding people from outside intrusion and starts shielding the family's image from the reality of its own members, the habit has inverted, and it has become a mechanism for producing damage rather than preventing it. That inversion connects directly to the most caricatured feature of British upper-class culture, the stiff upper lip. The phrase itself is worth a moment, because its origins are not what people assume. It appears in American print in the early 19th century, before it became attached to the English, and its association with British emotional restraint is a later development, cemented by imperial adventure fiction, by wartime propaganda, and by the culture of the Victorian public schools. But underneath the caricature is a real thing, and it had reasons. Families whose members were routinely sent into military service, colonial administration, diplomacy, the courts, or the management of large estates, had a practical interest in producing people who did not visibly fall apart. Emotional regulation, the capacity to remain functional and coherent while frightened or grieving, is not a fictional skill. It is genuinely useful, and in certain roles it saves lives. And there is a particular version of it that is essentially a courtesy. The refusal to make your distress everybody else's emergency. Handling something privately so that the room does not have to manage you. That, at its best, is a form of consideration. The problem is that regulation and suppression look almost identical from outside and are completely different inside. Regulation means feeling something fully and choosing when and where to express it. Suppression means not permitting the feeling at all, which does not remove it. It relocates it. At its most extreme, this produced a system that is now being examined seriously rather than romanticized. The practice of sending children, sometimes as young as 7, away to board, was for a long time simply what such families did. The psychotherapist Joy Chavrian has written extensively about the patterns she observed in adult patients who had gone through it, describing a cluster of difficulties around attachment, trust, and emotional expression that she termed boarding school syndrome. Her work, and that of others such as Nick Duffel, describes a specific adaptation. A child sent away learns very quickly that distress produces no rescue, and that the efficient response is to shut the feeling down and construct a competent, cheerful, self-sufficient exterior. That exterior is extremely effective. It performs well at interviews. It commands rooms. It runs institutions. It is also, in a number of the cases these clinicians describe, built on a loss that was never processed, and it can make intimacy in adult life genuinely difficult. So the same trait, in the same person, can be a strength at 40 in a crisis, and a wound at 50 in a marriage. Never Make a Scene produces dignity in one setting and dysfunction in another, and the culture that produced it was not sophisticated enough to tell the two apart. Let's move to something with more light in it, though it comes with its own shadow. There is an old principle, and the French phrase for it has stuck because the French phrased it best. Noblesse oblige. Nobility obliges. The idea, which appears in a collection of maxims published by the Duc de Lévis in 1808, and which long predates the phrase itself, is that inherited advantage carries inherited duty. In practice, this meant that the children of established families were pushed, sometimes with considerable force, towards particular kinds of life. Military service, and specifically the officer class, with a family regiment and an expectation of appearing in it. Diplomatic careers, politics, national or local, civil administration, the law, the church, which absorbed an enormous number of younger sons who had no estate coming to them. Magistracy, the management of the estate itself, which in a large landholding was a substantial administrative job. Charitable committees, school and hospital boards, later, foundations, trusteeships, and the governance of cultural institutions. Some of this was straightforwardly self-interested. Positions carried influence, and influence protected interests. A family with a member in parliament, and another on the bench, and a third running the county, was not merely serving, it was embedded, but it would be dishonest to reduce it entirely to calculation. Real institutions were funded, hospitals were built, schools were endowed, libraries were founded, museums were filled and then given away. The Quaker business families of Britain, the Cadburys, the Rowntrees, the Frys, built model villages, funded housing, pushed for social reform, and created trusts that continue to fund research and campaigning today. Joseph Rowntree established a set of trusts in 1904, deliberately structured so that some of the money could be used for political and social campaigning rather than only charity, because he had concluded that relieving poverty without addressing its causes was inadequate. Those trusts are still working, and the same period produced the most influential statement of the idea in the English language. Andrew Carnegie's essay of 1889, usually known as the Gospel of Wealth, argued that a man who dies rich dies disgraced, and that the wealthy have an obligation to administer their surplus for the public good during their own lifetimes. He proceeded to fund over 2,500 libraries, plus universities, concert halls and endowments that still operate. Carnegie also presided over Homestead in 1892, where a strike at his steelworks ended in armed conflict and deaths, and where the labor practices that generated the money for the libraries were exactly what the strikers were protesting about. Both things are true. That is the difficulty with noblesse oblige, and it should not be resolved too neatly. Critics have long pointed out that elite philanthropy can operate as reputational laundering, that it allows the wealthy to choose which social problems get attention according to their own preferences, and that it exercises public influence without public accountability. Rob Reich's work on the tension between large-scale private philanthropy and democratic institutions makes this argument carefully, and Anand Giridharadas has made the more polemical version. The critique is serious and it stands. And yet the underlying instruction, stripped of the hypocrisy that so often accompanied it, is not a bad one. If you have inherited advantages, you owe something back. It is worth noticing what that belief does psychologically to a child who absorbs it. It converts privilege from a possession into a debt. That is an unusual thing to feel, and it produces a particular kind of person, sometimes insufferable, occasionally admirable, generally busy. There is also a version of this that operates as repair rather than obligation. And there is one example I find genuinely moving. John Profumo was a British cabinet minister whose career ended in 1963 in one of the most spectacular political scandals of the century. He had lied to the House of Commons. He resigned in disgrace. What he then did was go to Toynbee Hall, a settlement house in the East End of London, and volunteer. He washed dishes. He did administrative work. He stayed for the rest of his life, eventually becoming closely involved in its governance and fundraising, and he did it for something in the region of 40 years, largely refusing to discuss the scandal. Whatever you make of the man, that is a reputation rebuilt in the only currency that actually works, which is time plus consistency, applied without an audience. Which brings us naturally to networks, and to a mechanism that is more important than almost anything else we have discussed, and much less understood. Most people, when they hear the word networking, picture something faintly humiliating: a room, a lanyard, a stranger, and a need. You approach somebody because you want something, and both of you know it, and the transaction is uncomfortable precisely because it is a transaction. Established networks do not work like that, and the difference is almost entirely a matter of timing. The relationships begin decades before anybody needs anything: at school, at university, in a club, at family gatherings, on a shooting weekend or a sailing weekend or in a regiment, at weddings in enormous numbers, at christenings, on charitable boards, in professional bodies, in the pew of a particular church. By the time somebody needs a favor, there has been 30 years of ordinary human contact underneath the request. The favor is not the beginning of a relationship, it is an incident within one. That is the entire difference between transactional networking and social capital, and it explains why one feels degrading and the other feels like friendship. The sociological literature here is rich. James Coleman and Robert Putnam developed the concept of social capital in different directions. Putnam most famously in his work on civic decline in America. But the finding I find most useful for our purposes came earlier, from Mark Granovetter, whose 1973 paper, The Strength of Weak Ties, reported something counterintuitive. When he studied how people had actually found their jobs, it was frequently not close friends who provided the decisive information, but acquaintances, people they saw occasionally. Close friends tend to know what you know, and to move in the circles you already move in. Acquaintances bridge into other worlds, which means the value of a network is not measured by intimacy. It is measured by reach and by trust. And a large stock of low-intensity relationships maintained over decades is an extraordinary asset. Trust also compounds, and this is the part that transfers across generations. A young person may be given an opportunity, not because of anything they have demonstrated, but because somebody trusted their father, or their mother's colleague, or their headmaster, or a man who was in the same regiment as their grandfather, and has been quietly returning that debt for 40 years. Which is where we have to be honest about the fairness of all this. These networks create genuine value. They also reproduce inequality with brutal efficiency. Every introduction that helps one person is, in a market with limited positions, a small disadvantage imposed on somebody who had no such introduction available. The mechanism does not have to be corrupt to be exclusionary. It only has to be normal. And it is worth understanding precisely why an introduction carries such force, because the mechanism is elegant. When somebody introduces you, they transfer a small amount of their own reputation. I know this person is not really a statement about knowledge. It is a statement of willingness. It means, I am prepared to attach my judgment to this individual, and if they behave badly, some of that will attach to me. That is why a recommendation from somebody with a great deal to lose is worth more than a recommendation from somebody with nothing at stake. The value is the exposure. You can see the whole logic in its historical form. Letters of introduction, which functioned as portable credit for a traveler, in an era when nobody could verify anything. The proposing and seconding system of private clubs, where the existing members put their own standing behind the newcomer. Guild apprenticeships, chambers pupillages, the entire architecture of a world where trust had to be transferred person to person because there was no other way. It has not gone away, it has just moved, which leads to what I think may be the deepest structural habit of all, and the one that most explains why certain families are still visible centuries later. Lasting influence rarely rests with individuals. It gets built into institutions. People die. Institutions do not, or at least they do not have to. So families that intend to persist attach themselves to things designed to outlive them. Universities, through endowments, chairs, buildings and governance. Museums, through donations and trusteeships. Banks and businesses with the family name on them. Churches and religious foundations. Political parties, charities, clubs, professional bodies, cultural organizations, boards of every conceivable kind. The Fugger family of Augsburg give us the most extraordinary single example I know of. Jakob Fugger, who died in 1525, was one of the wealthiest men in European history in relative terms, financing emperors, controlling mining interests across Central Europe, and effectively bankrolling the election of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor. Enormous financial power, exercised at the highest possible level. In 1521, he founded a housing settlement in Augsburg for needy citizens of the town, the Fuggerei. Residents paid a nominal annual rent and were required to pray daily for the founder and his family. It is still operating. It has been continuously inhabited for 5 centuries, apart from war damage which was repaired, and it is still administered by a Fugger family foundation. The annual rent remains a symbolic sum, unchanged in nominal terms since the 16th century, which today amounts to less than €1. The bank is long gone, the mining empire is long gone, the political power evaporated centuries ago. The almshouse, founded almost as a footnote, is still standing and still doing exactly what it was designed to do, 500 years after the man who built it died. That is what institutionalization means. You cannot put money in a box and expect it to survive 500 years. But you can build a thing that has a purpose, a governance structure, and a reason for other people to keep it going. And that thing may well outlast everything else you did. It also explains why established wealth so often feels invisible in the modern world. The family may no longer appear on any list of the richest people, but the name is on a building at a university. It is on a trust deed. It is in the governance documents of a museum. It is in the constitution of a charity that distributes several million a year. Influence has been converted from something you hold into something you sit on the board of. Breathe out. We're going to talk about marriage now, and then about the machinery underneath everything, and then, slowly, about endings. For most of recorded European history, elite marriage was not primarily a romantic arrangement. It was a merger. Marriage combined land, and land was the fundamental asset. It combined businesses. It transferred titles, which in some jurisdictions could pass through heiresses. It created political alliances that ended feuds or started them. It moved capital in the form of dowries and settlements, which were negotiated in detail by lawyers, and which frequently took longer to agree than the courtship. The Rothschild family provide the best documented example of dynastic marriage used deliberately as a preservation strategy. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, who died in Frankfurt in 1812, left instructions that shaped the family for a century. His 5 sons established houses in Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Naples, and Paris, operating as a coordinated partnership across borders at a time when that was an extraordinary competitive advantage. And through the 19th century, the family married extensively within itself, cousin to cousin, in order to keep capital and control inside the partnership rather than dispersing it through marriage settlements into other families. It was effective. It was also, by any modern standard, a considerable constraint on the lives of the individuals involved, particularly the women, whose exclusion from the business under the original arrangements was explicit. That world has largely gone. Nobody serious claims that wealthy families today are systematically arranging marriages in Western societies. But something subtler persists, and it may be more powerful precisely because nobody has to do anything. People marry people they meet. That is not a profound observation, but its consequences are enormous. And where you meet people is determined by where you were educated, where you live, where you work, and how you spend your leisure. Sociologists call the result assortative mating, the tendency of people to partner with those similar to themselves in education, income, and background. The research literature, including work by Jeremy Greenwood and colleagues on rising educational assortative mating in the United States, and a substantial body of work by Robert Mayer and others on the long-term patterns, suggests this has increased in recent decades as higher education has expanded and sorted people more efficiently, which means the outcome of an explicit dynastic strategy can now be produced by nothing more than a university admissions system and a social calendar. 2 graduates of similar institutions meet, fall in love entirely genuinely, and merge 2 sets of capital, 2 networks, and 2 sets of expectations, without anyone ever intending a merger. The old families did it on purpose. Modern society does it by accident, and possibly more thoroughly. There is a related concern which is less romantic, and which families with substantial assets take extremely seriously. And I want to frame it carefully, because it can easily be stated in an ugly way. A large family enterprise can be destabilized by events inside a marriage. Divorce can force the sale of assets that were never meant to be sold. Conflict between branches can paralyze decisions for years. Heirs with fundamentally different values can deadlock a business. Litigation between family members can consume both the money and the relationships. None of that means spouses are threats. That framing is both offensive and inaccurate, and it has historically been used to justify some genuinely unpleasant behavior towards people marrying in. The more honest version is about compatibility around responsibility. If one person in a marriage regards the family's assets as a shared long-term obligation, and the other regards them as an available resource, that is not a difference in affection. It is a difference in worldview, and it will surface eventually, usually under stress. This is why prenuptial agreements, marriage settlements, and trust structures have such a long history in this world, long predating their current reputation. A 19th century marriage settlement was, in part, a mechanism for protecting a bride's property from her husband's creditors at a time when married women's property rights were severely limited. The instruments are old. What they are protecting has shifted. Now let's come to what I think is psychologically the most important section of the whole documentary, and it concerns the thing everybody assumes is uncomplicatedly good. Inheritance can damage people. Not always, not inevitably, but often enough, and predictably enough, that the families who think longest about this treat unprepared inheritance as a serious risk rather than a gift. Consider what happens when a person receives, at 25, enough money that work becomes optional forever. The first thing that can go is motivation, and not because the person is lazy. Motivation is substantially structured by necessity. Remove necessity entirely, and you have to generate purpose from the inside, which is a genuinely difficult psychological task that most people never have to attempt. The second thing that can go is identity. If you did not earn it, then what are you? Some heirs describe a persistent difficulty in knowing whether any professional achievement was real, since access, introductions, and safety nets were all present. Praise becomes unreliable. Criticism becomes unreliable. It becomes hard to locate yourself. Then there is the problem of relationships. When you cannot be certain why people want to be near you, intimacy becomes an area of permanent low-grade suspicion. And there is the specific pathology of entitlement, which is less about arrogance than about a distorted expectation of frictionlessness, and which tends to produce a person who is remarkably fragile when the friction eventually arrives. Family conflict follows because shared inherited assets require agreement among people who did not choose each other, and disagreements about money between siblings are rarely about money. The Vanderbilts are the standard cautionary example, and they earn the position. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, leaving a fortune generally estimated at around $100 million, which was reportedly larger than the amount held in the United States Treasury at the time. He was a hard, difficult, extraordinarily capable man who had built it from shipping and railways. He left the overwhelming majority to a single son, William Henry, precisely because he believed dividing it would destroy it. William Henry roughly doubled it, and then the third and fourth generations built the great houses, the breakers at Newport, Marble House, enormous properties on Fifth Avenue that were demolished within living memory of their construction. The money went into consumption, competitive social display and maintenance costs on a scale that produced no return. Arthur T. Vanderbilt II, a descendant, wrote the standard account of the decline, and reported that when the family held a reunion at Vanderbilt University in the 1970s, there was no millionaire among them. One branch is instructive by contrast. George Washington Vanderbilt built Biltmore in North Carolina, an estate on a scale that was arguably indefensible even by the standards of the family. It could easily have gone the way of the rest. Instead, his descendants, through the Cecil family, turned it into a functioning business, opened it to the public in the 1930s, and built around it a winery, hotels, and a substantial tourism operation. It remains family-owned. The difference between the two outcomes is not the size of the initial asset. It is whether the asset was converted into an enterprise with a reason to exist. So how do families try to prepare heirs given all this? The approaches are reasonably consistent across cultures, and they are all imperfect. Education that emphasizes capability rather than credentials. Requiring young family members to work outside the family business first, so that at least one professional judgment about them has been made by somebody with no reason to be kind. Graduated responsibility, rather than a single transfer of control. Trust structures that separate benefit from control, so that a 25-year-old receives security, but not the ability to liquidate a century of accumulation. Involvement in the family's philanthropy, which is often the training ground, because it involves governance, decisions, and consequences at a scale where mistakes are survivable. Explicit financial education, family councils, mentorship from non-family professionals who are permitted to say difficult things. Do these work? Sometimes. There is no reliable formula, and every family that thinks it has found one is one difficult grandchild away from discovering otherwise. But the underlying question is a beautiful one, and it applies to anybody raising a child in comfortable circumstances, at any income level at all. How do you give somebody security without removing their need to become someone? There is no clean answer. Too little security, and a person spends their life anxious. Too much, and they may never find out what they would have done. Related to this is a distinction that matters enormously in family businesses: and which the successful ones enforce and the failing ones do not. Inheriting assets is not the same as inheriting authority. You can leave somebody shares. You cannot leave them competence, and you certainly cannot leave them the respect of the people who will have to work for them. The multi-generational businesses that survive tend to be strict about this in a way that can look harsh from inside the family. Heirs are expected to be qualified, to work elsewhere for a period of years, to enter at a genuine level rather than a symbolic one, to be assessed by people who do not share their surname, to earn board responsibility gradually, and in some families to accept that they may never be given operational control at all, because the family's job is to be good owners rather than to be automatic managers. That last distinction is one of the most important ideas in family business, and it took a lot of destroyed companies to learn it. Being a competent owner, meaning selecting good management, setting direction, holding people accountable, and providing patient capital, is a real skill and an honorable role. Assuming you can run the business because your grandfather founded it is how businesses die. Which brings us to the machinery, the unglamorous architecture underneath all of this. I'll keep it brief and conceptual, because this is a documentary and not a tax seminar, and because the philosophical point is much more interesting than the mechanics. The oldest instrument in this story is the trust, and its origin is genuinely charming. In medieval England, a landowner going away for a long time, on crusade or otherwise, faced a problem. He needed somebody to hold his land, but if he transferred it, he might not get it back. The solution that developed was to convey the land to a trusted person, on the understanding that it was to be held for the benefit of the owner or his family. When the trusted person occasionally declined to hand it back, the courts of equity intervened to enforce the understanding, and out of that grew one of the most consequential legal devices in the world. The essential move is the separation of ownership into two parts: legal ownership, which is control, and beneficial interest, which is benefit. Once you can split those, you can build almost anything. You can give a 19-year-old an income without giving them the power to sell the estate. You can hold an asset across 3 generations without it belonging outright to any of them. You can require multiple people to agree before something irreversible happens. Around that core, families built the rest, holding companies to keep operating businesses under coordinated ownership. Family offices, effectively a private staff managing investments, administration, property, tax, and often the family's charitable work. The Rockefeller family's office, known for decades by its address as Room 5600, is generally regarded as the model for the modern version. Foundations, which institutionalize the giving, and also, not incidentally, institutionalize the family's involvement in public life. Governance documents, different classes of shares, separating economic interest from voting control. Professional trustees, who exist partly to be the person willing to say no. I am not going to discuss jurisdictions, and I am certainly not offering financial advice. What I want you to take from this is the philosophical shape of it. Wealth that lasts is generally not sitting in one person's account. It has been institutionalized. It has been converted from a possession into a structure, with rules, obligations, decision-making processes, and people whose job is to protect it from the enthusiasms of any individual family member, including the current head of the family. Which sounds cold, and is. It is also why some of it is still there. There is a related habit that quietly contradicts a popular assumption. People imagine that wealthy families are personally sophisticated about investment, law, and tax. Often they are not, and the good ones know it. The actual skill is not omniscience. It is knowing the boundaries of your own competence and buying the rest, carefully, from people you have vetted, and then continuing to supervise them. Lawyers, accountants, investment managers, trustees, land agents and estate managers, surveyors, architects and conservation specialists, archivists, in the families that keep records seriously. Art advisors, tax specialists, and the risk that comes with all of it, which every family that has been burnt will tell you about, is that professional advisors can become an unaccountable layer of their own, expensive, self-perpetuating, and quietly making decisions that nobody in the family fully understands. The discipline is not delegation, it is delegation with supervision, which is much harder. Debt deserves a moment too, because attitudes to it are frequently misdescribed. Established families have not historically avoided debt. Many were built on it. Estates were mortgaged to fund improvements, enclosures, mines, canals and railways. Aristocratic borrowing financed a substantial portion of British industrial development. Debt against a productive asset, at a manageable cost, is simply the use of time, but borrowing has also destroyed a great many of them. The 19th century is full of estates crushed by accumulated mortgages taken out to fund lifestyle rather than production, particularly once agricultural rents collapsed during the Depression of the 1870s and 80s. Gambling debts ruined individual families with spectacular speed. The distinction is not moral, it is structural. Borrowing against something that generates, in order to make it generate more, is a tool. Borrowing to sustain a level of consumption that the underlying asset cannot support is a countdown. And when it goes wrong, it can end anything, regardless of age. Kongo Gumi, a Japanese construction company that specialized in Buddhist temples, was founded in 578 and run by the same family for something in the order of 40 generations, 14 centuries. It survived the arrival and departure of samurai government, civil wars, the Meiji Restoration, the Second World War. In 2006, carrying debts accumulated during Japan's asset bubble and struggling with declining temple construction, it was liquidated and its operations absorbed by another company. 1400 years, ended by leverage and a change in demand. There is no such thing as too old to fail. There's a phrase in English that has escaped its origin and become proverbial, and it takes us to the heart of asset preservation: selling the family silver. It comes from a speech given by Harold Macmillan, by then the Earl of Stockton, in November 1985, when he was 91 years old. Speaking about the privatization program then underway, he made a comparison with a family in financial difficulty selling its possessions. First the Georgian silver goes, then the fine furniture, then the Canalettos. He was not, in fact, using the exact phrase that has come down to us, but the image was so precise that the phrase formed around it. What he was describing is the mechanism by which established families most commonly disappear, and it is rarely dramatic. It is incremental. The estate cannot quite fund the way of life, so a farm is sold. That covers a few years. Then a small painting, and nobody notices. Then an outlying property. Then a better painting. Each individual decision is reasonable, and each one reduces the productive base, which increases the pressure on the next decision, and the whole thing runs quietly downhill over 40 years, until there is a house nobody can afford to heat, and nothing left to sell to heat it. The families who survive tend to do the psychologically harder thing, which is to reduce the way of life rather than the asset base. Close the wing, reduce the staff, let the London house go, and keep the land, because the land generates, and the London house does not. But, and this is important, the opposite failure is just as real, and preservation can become a kind of madness. Britain lost something in the order of 1,000 or more country houses during the 20th century, demolished, abandoned or destroyed. The scale of it only entered public consciousness with an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1974, the destruction of the country house, which displayed the lost buildings and shocked a great many people who had not realized what had been happening. Estate duty introduced in the 1890s and progressively increased. Agricultural depression, 2 wars that killed a generation of heirs, and sometimes 2 heirs in succession, and maintenance costs on buildings designed for an era of cheap servants, all combined into an extinction event. Some of those families held on far too long. They refused to sell anything, refused to open the house, refused to adapt, and watched the roof fail room by room until the whole thing had to come down. Sentiment cost them everything they were trying to protect. Chatsworth shows the alternative, and it is one of the clearest case studies available. The 10th Duke of Devonshire died in 1950. The timing was catastrophic, falling within the period that made the estate liable to death duties at a punishing rate, and the resulting liability was enormous, taking many years to discharge. The 11th Duke and Duchess, Andrew and Deborah Cavendish, made a series of hard decisions. Land was sold. Works of art were handed to the treasury in lieu of tax. Hardwicke Hall, one of the great Elizabethan houses of England, went to the National Trust. They then moved into Chatsworth itself, which had been largely unoccupied, and set about turning it into something that could pay for itself, with visitors, a farm shop, and a serious commercial operation around the estate. And in 1981 they placed the house, its most important contents, and the park into a charitable trust, the Chatsworth House Trust, which now holds them for the public benefit, with the family leasing the private apartments. Look at what that sequence involves: selling substantial assets, giving away a great house, opening the family home to paying strangers, converting private property into a charitable institution. Every one of those decisions would have been unthinkable to an ancestor. And the result is that Chatsworth is still there, still full, still lived in, and no longer dependent on the fortunes of any individual duke. Adapt or preserve is a false choice. What actually works is adapting the form in order to preserve the substance, and knowing which is which. Underneath all of this is the least glamorous habit in the entire subject, and possibly the most important: maintenance. The photograph shows a house at golden hour with the light on the stone. What the photograph does not show is the roof survey, the lead flashing, the gutters, which if neglected for 3 winters will put water into a wall that will then take a decade and a fortune to dry out, the drainage, the insurance schedule, the heating system that costs more to run than a normal person's house costs to buy, the trees which need managing on a 50-year cycle, the boundary dispute that has been rumbling since 1960, the staff, the paperwork, the rolling program of repointing, replastering, rewiring, and repainting that never finishes, because by the time you reach the end, you start again. Preserving something for a century and a half is mostly this. It is unglamorous, expensive, invisible work performed continuously by people whose names are not on anything. And it generalizes so cleanly that it is almost a law. What lasts is usually maintained long before it visibly breaks. That is true of buildings. It is true of businesses, where the boring reinvestment made in good years is what carries you through the bad ones. It is true of reputations, which are maintained by 1,000 small acts of reliability rather than repaired after a crisis. It is true of relationships, which are sustained by unremarkable contact over decades rather than rescued by grand gestures. It is true of health, which is where most of us learn the lesson too late. Nobody photographs maintenance. Nobody applauds it. It is the entire game. Let's come back to taste for a moment, because we can now see it more clearly. What people call good taste is largely fluency, and fluency is a product of exposure and repetition. Somebody who grew up in rooms containing certain kinds of object, hearing them discussed, seeing them chosen and rejected, absorbs a set of discriminations they did not consciously acquire. Later they walk into a room and know instantly what is wrong with it, and they experience this as perception rather than as education. But taste is culturally constructed and it moves. The things regarded as vulgar in one century become desirable in the next. Victorian interiors were considered oppressive rubbish by the modernists and are now painstakingly restored. Brown furniture was fashionable, then unsellable, and is now recovering. The confident aesthetic judgments of any given elite in any given decade are, viewed from 2 centuries away, simply the local dialect. Let us not pretend any class's preferences are objectively superior. What is real is the mechanism. Repeated exposure creates fluency, and fluency looks effortless from outside. The same principle explains clothing, which is where the modern conversation about all this tends to get stuck. The genuine principle is not expensive versus cheap, or logos versus no logos. It is context. Country clothes in the country, and they are functional rather than decorative, because their job is to keep you warm and dry while something unpleasant happens outdoors. Formal dress when formality is required. Business clothing for business. Informality when informality is appropriate. The signal being sent is not, "I have money." It is, "I understand what this occasion is." Dressing for the room rather than for the camera is a social competence, not a moral virtue, and its value is that it demonstrates you have read the situation correctly. Which is also, incidentally, why getting it wrong in either direction causes discomfort. Overdressing announces that you have misjudged the event. Underdressing announces that you did not think it warranted the effort, which leads into manners, and here I want to make an argument that I think is genuinely useful. Etiquette is not fundamentally about cutlery. It is a technology for reducing friction. Look at what the actual rules do. Introducing people, so that nobody has to stand in a group wondering who everybody is. Being punctual, so that other people can plan. Replying to invitations, so that a host knows how many chairs to put out. Writing to thank somebody, so that the effort they made is acknowledged and they are willing to make it again. Not monopolizing conversation, so that the room functions. Noticing the person who knows nobody. Treating staff decently, because they are people, and also because everybody is watching. Knowing when to leave, so that your hosts do not have to invent a reason. Every one of those rules exists to reduce uncertainty for somebody else, and that is the deep point. Predictable behavior creates trust, and trust is the most valuable social commodity there is. If people know how you will behave, they can rely on you. If they can rely on you, they will include you in things. Which is why the codes were enforced so seriously. They were not decoration. They were operating instructions for a society where reputation was infrastructure. But there is a test that cuts through all of it, and it is the moral center of this whole territory. How do you treat people who cannot help you? Waiters, drivers, cleaners, assistants, junior staff, tradespeople, anybody whose position means that being rude to them carries no cost. The old ideal, articulated repeatedly across centuries of conduct literature, is courtesy regardless of rank, and it is the point where good manners stop being a technique and become a character trait. Manners that are performed upwards and abandoned downwards are not manners. They are a negotiating posture. And the honest history here is grim. Elite households were not universally benevolent, and the relationship between employers and domestic staff was structurally unequal in a way that produced enormous suffering. Servants worked punishing hours for minimal wages, lived in accommodation their employers would not have tolerated, were dismissed without reference for pregnancy or illness, and had almost no legal protection. Some households were genuinely humane, with employees who stayed for a lifetime and were provided for in old age. Others were not, and the difference depended entirely on the character of the family, because nothing in the system compelled decency. So when we talk about manners as a habit of established families, we have to hold both facts. The ideal was articulated with real seriousness. It was also, frequently, not honored at exactly the point where honoring it would have cost something, which is the useful question to carry away And it applies to everybody, at every income level. What are your manners actually worth if they disappear when the power is unequal? Alongside courtesy sits reliability, which is even less glamorous. Turning up when you said you would. Replying. Keeping agreements that have become inconvenient. Remembering what you committed to. Paying what you owe. On time. Thanking people. Following through on the small thing you offered casually 3 weeks ago and could easily assume nobody remembers. None of it is impressive individually. Nobody has ever told a story about somebody who replied promptly. But across 10 years, these produce something extremely rare, which is a person other people trust without having to think about it. And across 3 generations, they produce a surname that opens doors, which is the only mechanism by which a family reputation is ever actually built. Not through grand achievements, through several thousand ordinary interactions that each went the way they were supposed to. The house is quieter now. Let yourself go heavy where you're lying. There's not much left to follow closely. There's a habit that has nothing to do with money at all, and which I suspect is the one most worth stealing. Established families have historically cultivated private interests. Things pursued seriously over decades that were never intended to be displayed, monetized, or admired by strangers. Gardening, pursued to a level of expertise that would embarrass most professionals. Local history, ornithology, horses, music, played badly in a room with nobody listening. Architecture, conservation, sailing, languages, collecting something obscure and cataloging it meticulously, restoring things, beekeeping, archaeology on one's own land, which produced a remarkable amount of genuine 19th century scholarship, along with a certain amount of damage. Some of this was simply what people did with unstructured time. But the pattern is worth noticing, because it points to something that has become very rare. An inner life that does not require an audience. Consider what that provides. A source of satisfaction that cannot be taken away by a market, a critic, or a change in fashion. A form of progress that is measured against yourself. A reason to be interested in the world that survives retirement, illness, reversal, and disgrace. And a self that exists independently of how you are currently being perceived. Now hold that against the present moment, where an enormous amount of human activity has become performative by default, where a hobby is expected to become a side business, where an experience is not quite complete until it has been documented, where the question of whether a thing is worth doing has quietly been replaced by the question of whether it will read well. If everything must be photographed, monetized, or shown, then private enjoyment gradually disappears, and with it, the part of you that exists when nobody is looking, which connects directly to privacy and to a reframing that I think is genuinely important. Privacy is not primarily about hiding, it is a form of freedom. A person whose sense of self does not depend on the approval of strangers has more room to live. They can change their mind without it being a public reversal. They can fail without it becoming a narrative. They can hold an unfashionable opinion, take a risk, look ridiculous, grieve badly, or spend a year doing something pointless, without any of it entering a permanent record. Established families protected this instinctively, and often for self-interested reasons. Private houses behind long drives, private clubs, correspondence rather than publication, photographs that stayed in albums, limited contact with the press, which in Britain hardened into an entire etiquette about when it was acceptable for a family to appear in a newspaper, the traditional answer being birth, marriage and death, and no other occasion. Some of that was snobbery. Some of it was the concealment of misconduct, which we have already dealt with honestly, but some of it was a genuine understanding that visibility has costs, and that those costs are paid by everyone in the family, including the children who did not choose it. The question worth sitting with is not whether privacy is virtuous, it is this: What changes about a person when their identity no longer depends on being watched? I suspect quite a lot changes, and I suspect most of it is good. There's another pattern here, which is a reluctance to chase novelty for its own sake, and it needs to be handled carefully, because the popular version of it is nonsense. The furniture stays. Silhouettes evolve slowly. Investment approaches tend to be conservative, favoring preservation over spectacular return, because a family that has been through 3 depressions is more interested in surviving the 4th than in outperforming anybody. Rituals persist, sometimes long past the point where anybody remembers why. The useful distinction is between innovation that genuinely improves something and novelty pursued because it is new. Central heating, proper wiring and modern drainage were improvements, and the families who installed them fared considerably better than the ones who did not. But conservatism is not automatically wisdom, and this is where the romantic version of old money falls apart completely. A very large number of established families were destroyed precisely because they would not adapt. British landed families who could not conceive of their sons entering trade, at exactly the moment when agricultural income was collapsing and industrial income was not. Aristocracies across Europe who regarded commercial activity as beneath them, while the commercial classes bought their houses. Family businesses that refused to professionalize, refused to bring in outside management, refused to change a product, and disappeared with dignity. Which means the actual habit is not resistance to change. It is selective change, and specifically the ability to distinguish between the identity of a thing and the form it currently takes. The families and institutions that persist over very long periods have almost always changed dramatically. Estates that became tourism businesses, conference venues, wedding venues, film locations. Highclere Castle, whose upkeep requirements are formidable, benefiting substantially from a decade as the location for a globally successful television series. Longleat, where the 6th Marquess of Bath opened a safari park in 1966 to an outcry from parts of the aristocracy who considered it undignified, and which secured the estate's future. Businesses that diversified out of dying industries, collections that became foundations, palaces that became hotels, family firms that hired professional chief executives and confined the family to the board. The Italian wine houses are a good example of the pattern in its most graceful form. Families such as the Antinori and the Frescobaldi have been in the wine trade in Tuscany since the 14th century and are among the members of the Henocians, an association restricted to companies over 200 years old that remain owned and led by the founding family. What they make, how they make it, where they sell it and who buys it have changed beyond recognition many times over. The continuity is not in the product, it is in the family, the land, and the intention. Adapt the form, keep the substance. That is the whole trick. And the difficulty is that almost nobody can tell which is which at the time. There is one more transmission mechanism to discuss, and it is the oldest technology humans have: stories. Children in these families grow up hearing about people they never met, an ancestor who did something remarkable in a war, a great-grandmother who ran the estate for 20 years while her husband was elsewhere and did it better, a business that nearly failed and how it was saved, a house that was lost, a cousin who gambled everything away, whose name is still used as a warning, a journey somebody made with nothing, a sacrifice. These stories are not entertainment. Although they are often entertaining, they are instruction, and they operate on 3 levels simultaneously. They say, "This is who we are." They say, "This is what we value." And they say, "This is what people like us are expected to do." That third one is powerful and double-edged. It can produce an extraordinary sense of responsibility in a young person, a feeling of being part of something that preceded them and will continue after them. It can also produce crushing pressure, a life spent measuring yourself against a portrait, and a private certainty that you are the one who is going to let everybody down. Family narrative can be a foundation or a cage, and it is usually a little of both. But there is one variety of family story that is unusually valuable, and it is the one most families suppress: the failures. Who lost the money and how? Who trusted the wrong partner? Which investment destroyed a generation's security? Which inheritance dispute stopped two branches speaking for 50 years? Which scandal cost the family a position it never recovered? A first-generation fortune has money and momentum and very little else. A fifth-generation fortune, if the family has been honest with itself, also possesses something no amount of money can purchase, which is 5 generations of documented mistakes made by people with the same temperament, in the same circumstances, and available for study. That is institutional memory, and it is the reason old organizations sometimes make better decisions than clever new ones. Not because they are wiser, but because they have already made the error and it hurt. The families that hide their failures give up this advantage entirely, and they tend to make the same mistake twice, roughly 70 years apart, which is exactly long enough for everybody who remembers to be dead. As families grow, all of this eventually has to be formalized, and modern wealthy families increasingly do so explicitly. The arithmetic is unforgiving. 1 founder becomes 4 children. 4 children become 12 grandchildren. 12 become 30 or 40 cousins who have never lived in the same house, live in different countries, have different tax positions, different politics, different levels of interest in the family business, and radically different financial needs. Some want income, some want to sell, some want to run the thing. Some have not spoken to their branch in a decade. Informal arrangements that worked when it was 1 family around 1 table become unworkable when it is 40 people across 4 continents. So families write things down. Family constitutions, setting out how decisions are made. Family councils, which meet regularly. Rules about employment in the family business, typically requiring qualifications and outside experience. Structured education for the next generation. Formal conflict resolution processes. Shared decision-making on philanthropy, which is often deliberately used as the low-stakes arena in which younger members learn to disagree productively. This is not new. The Mitsui family in Japan, whose commercial house dates from the 1670s, produced a written family code in the early 18th century, governing the conduct of the business, the relations between branches, and the obligations of members, and it is one of the earliest documented family constitutions anywhere. The modern French examples are among the most striking. The Moulier family, associated with a substantial group of retail businesses, operate through a family association with a written charter, rules governing the sale of shares within the family, and a membership running into the hundreds. The Wendell family, whose involvement in iron and steel in Lorraine dates to the early 18th century, has passed through revolutions, invasions, nationalization, and reinvention as a listed investment company, and continues to coordinate a very large number of family shareholders through formal structures. What all these arrangements really are, underneath the legal language, is an attempt to answer one question: how do you keep a group of people cooperating after everybody who knew each other personally has died? That is the same question that produces constitutions, religious orders, universities, and states. Families that last are, in a small way, solving a political problem rather than a financial one. We're moving towards the end now, so let everything soften. Nothing that follows requires you to be awake for it. If I had to name the single psychological trait underneath everything we have talked about tonight, it would not be discipline, or taste, or discretion. It would be the willingness to wait. Delay runs through all of it. Not buying immediately, not responding to a provocation immediately, building a relationship over 30 years with no particular purpose in mind, holding an asset through 2 bad decades, allowing a young person to develop slowly rather than handing them control, letting a reputation accumulate rather than announcing it, letting an investment compound rather than harvesting it. The great advantage of inherited capital is frequently not its size, it is its duration. Money plus time becomes something categorically different from money. A modest sum, left alone for a century, becomes a large sum, and the mathematics of that are not intuitive to a mind built for a lifespan of 70 years. A relationship maintained for 40 years is not the same kind of object as a relationship maintained for 4. Knowledge accumulated across 5 generations is not a bigger version of knowledge accumulated across 1. And this is where the truly interesting idea arrives, the one I want to leave with you above all the others. Compounding is not only financial. We use the word almost exclusively about money, but the same process operates on nearly everything that matters, provided it is left in place long enough and not interrupted. Knowledge compounds, because what you already understand determines how quickly you can absorb what comes next, which is why learning accelerates rather than proceeding at a constant rate. Relationships compound, because trust established early makes the next interaction easier, which builds more trust. Reputation compounds, because each reliable act makes the next one more credible, until eventually, your name does work you are not present for. Institutional memory compounds. Archives compound. Property compounds, in the sense that a maintained building requires less intervention than a neglected one. Social confidence compounds, because each room you survive makes the next room smaller. Even taste compounds, since each thing you look at carefully makes the next thing easier to see. So imagine a child inheriting not simply a sum of money, but 150 years of accumulated relationships, a functioning network of institutional familiarity, a household vocabulary for finance and law, a name that people have already decided to trust, a body of documented family mistakes, and the unshakable expectation that they belong in whatever room they walk into. Now imagine trying to reproduce that in a single lifetime with cash. You cannot. That is the honest answer. Cash can buy the house, the schooling, the clothes, and the introductions after a fashion. It cannot buy duration, and duration is the active ingredient. The evidence for how long these effects persist is genuinely startling, and 2 studies in particular are worth knowing about. Gregory Clark, an economic historian, took an unusual approach to social mobility. Rather than tracking parents and children across 2 generations, which is the standard method, he tracked rare surnames across many generations, using them to follow families through university registers, professional records, and wealth records over centuries. His argument, developed in The Sun Also Rises in 2014, is that conventional studies substantially overstate mobility, and that underlying social status persists across generations far more strongly than the standard measures suggest, with the effect visible over 300 years and more in societies as different as England, Sweden, the United States, China, and India. His conclusions are contested, and I want to be clear about that. Critics argue that rare surnames are an unrepresentative sample, and that his methods overstate persistence. It is a live academic dispute rather than a settled finding. The second study is harder to argue with, and I find it almost eerie. 2 economists at the Bank of Italy, Guglielmo Barone and Sauro Mocetti, compared the tax records of Florence in 1427, the year of a detailed and remarkably complete municipal survey of household wealth, with the income tax records of Florence in 2011. They matched surnames across a gap of nearly 600 years. The families near the top of the distribution in the 15th century were still, on average, near the top in the 21st. 6 centuries. The Medici had not yet become dukes. Columbus had not been born. And the pattern held. Now, surnames are an imperfect proxy, and the authors are appropriately careful about the limitations. But even allowing for every caveat, that is an extraordinary result, and it should permanently change how anybody thinks about the phrase social mobility. Against all of that, we must set the opposite truth, and it is just as important. Fortunes disappear constantly, including old ones. There is a proverb about this in almost every commercial culture, which tells you it describes something universal. In America, from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. In Lancashire, clogs to clogs. In Italy, from the stables to the stars and back to the stables. In Japan, rice paddies to rice paddies. In Spain, the grandfather a dealer, the son a gentleman, the grandson a beggar. Every culture that has generated commercial wealth has noticed the same pattern and made a saying out of it. You will often hear this quoted as a statistic, usually in the form that 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the 2nd generation and 90% by the 3rd. That figure comes from work by Roy Williams and Vic Pricer, published in the early 2000s, based on a survey of families they had worked with. It gets repeated constantly, frequently without attribution, and it is worth knowing that its methodology has been criticized, and that it should be treated as an indicative observation from a particular sample, rather than a robust general finding. The proverbs are older and probably more reliable than the statistic. So why does it happen? For newly created fortunes, the failure modes are reasonably consistent, and I want to say clearly that this is not a criticism of first-generation wealth. Plenty of self-made families preserve wealth superbly, and plenty of ancient ones lose everything. But the specific risks differ. Lifestyle expands to consume the fortune, and expanded lifestyle is extremely difficult to reverse. Everything is concentrated in a single business, which is exactly what made the fortune and exactly what threatens it when the industry turns. There is no succession plan because the founder is not psychologically capable of imagining the enterprise without them. The heirs have been given comfort but not competence. The founder's overconfidence, which was essential to building the thing, becomes fatal when applied to areas they do not understand. The legal and tax complexity is underestimated until it is too late, and the entire identity of the business is bound up with one person, so that when they die, the thing that made it work is simply gone. For established fortunes, the destroyers are different and often external. War, which erases property outright. Revolution, which erases the class along with the property. The Russian nobility ceased to exist as a propertied class within a few years of 1917. Taxation, which in Britain took estates apart over the course of the 20th century, through estate duty, applied at rates that could exceed 80%, occasionally twice in a decade, when heirs were killed in war. In Japan, the entire hereditary peerage was abolished under the post-war constitution in 1947, and accompanied by property taxes that dismantled the great family holdings. Inflation, which quietly destroyed fixed incomes and bond-based fortunes across Europe in the 20th century. Economic transformation, which stranded families whose wealth was tied to a technology or a commodity that stopped mattering. Debt, gambling, litigation, divorce. Estates whose maintenance costs exceeded their income for 50 consecutive years. Political collapse. Too many heirs, and not enough asset. Incompetent management defended by loyalty, and the refusal to adapt that we have already discussed. The point is not that old money possesses magic. It is that survival at this timescale is genuinely difficult, which is precisely what makes the families who manage it worth examining. There is also a considerable amount of luck involved, and any account that leaves it out is dishonest. Which side of a border you happen to be on in 1945, whether your heir died at the Somme, whether your city was bombed, Whether the land you happen to own turned out to be under a city, or under a motorway, or under nothing at all. We tend to look at the survivors and infer strategy, when a substantial part of what we are seeing is survivorship. The families with the same habits who were unlucky are not available for study, because they are not there. Which brings us to the last illusion, and it is the one that makes all of this so easy to misunderstand from outside. Established wealth looks effortless.